The alarms had been screaming for 3 hours straight before someone finally turned them off. Nobody needed the alarms anymore, because everyone in the Geneva Deep Bunker could see what was happening on the massive holographic display that floated above the war table like a dying star surrounded by wolves. 12,000 warships had entered the Sol system, and they were not here to talk. Admiral Rin Velasquez stood at the center of the room with her arms folded behind her back, and her dark eyes locked on the display in front of her, as if she were studying a painting in a museum and not the end of humanity as everyone knew it. The ships belonged to the Velkari Dominion, and they moved with the kind of mechanical perfection that came from doing something many, many times before. They spread out around Earth in a massive sphere, and every direction anyone looked, there was another warship blocking the way, like bars on a cage. Formation the Cage of Silence, and they had used it on over 40 species across the galaxy, and not a single one had ever broken free. Every species that saw the Cage of Silence did the same thing. They begged, they cried, they surrendered, and then they were absorbed into the Dominion like water soaking into dry sand, and the galaxy forgot they ever existed. Colonel Marco Reyes stood to the left of the Admiral, and his face was white as paper, and his hands were shaking, even though he was doing his best to hide it behind a datapad he was pretending to read. "Admiral," he said, and his voice cracked just slightly. "The Velkari Supreme Commander is broadcasting on all channels, and he wants a response within 6 hours, or he says they will begin orbital bombardment." Velasquez did not turn around. "Play it," she said. The holographic display shifted, and the face of Archon Thalvrex filled the room like a nightmare projected onto the walls. He was enormous, even by Velkari standards, and his skin was the color of iron left out in the rain, and his 4 eyes glowed with a dull orange light that made him look like something that crawled out of a furnace. His voice was deep and calm, the way a predator is calm when it knows its prey cannot run. "People of Earth," the Archon said, "I am Thalvrex, and I speak for the Velkari Dominion, which has ruled this region of the galaxy for 10,000 years and has never once been defeated in open war." He paused and let the weight of that settle over every human watching. "You are surrounded, and your fleet is small, and your technology is unremarkable, and your world sits alone in the dark of space with no allies strong enough to save you. I have studied your species, and I know you are proud, and I know you believe you are special, but I must tell you that every species believes it is special right up until the moment it kneels. You're ours to accept total and unconditional surrender, and if you do not, then my fleet will reduce your cities to glass, and your oceans to steam, and your name will be forgotten by every star that shines." The transmission ended, and the room was so quiet that Velasquez could hear the humming of the air recyclers buried deep in the walls. She looked around the room at the faces of her officers, and she saw exactly what Thalvrex wanted her to see. Fear. Real, bone-deep fear that crawled up from the stomach and wrapped itself around the throat like a cold hand. Colonel Reyes spoke again, and this time his voice was barely above a whisper. "Admiral, what do we do?" She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something that confused every single person in that room. She smiled. Not a nervous smile, and not the kind of smile someone makes when they are pretending to be brave. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this exact moment, and was almost relieved that it had finally arrived. "Colonel," she said, "open the sealed archive and pull up the file marked Doctrine Ghost Veil." Reyes blinked. "I have never heard of that file, Admiral." "No," she said, "you have not, and neither has anyone in this room, because until 60 seconds ago it was classified above every clearance level you have ever seen." She reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out a small black card that looked like it was made of glass, and she pressed her thumb against it, and it glowed red, then blue, then white. The holographic display flickered, and then a new file appeared on the screen, and it was massive. It contained fleet positions and weapon specifications and supply chain routes and construction logs and communication intercepts dating back over 30 years. And there was so much data that the display had to zoom out 3 times just to show the table of contents. At it, and his mouth fell open. "Admiral," he said slowly, "what is this?" Velasquez turned back to the display and looked at the Valkyrie armada sitting around Earth like a noose made of steel and fire. 32 years ago, she said, we detected Valkyrie scout ships at the edge of the Oort cloud, and we knew right then that they would come for us eventually, because that is what they do, and they have never once made an exception. She pointed at the data now flooding across every screen in the room. So we started preparing, and we never stopped, and we never told anyone, and we built something so large and so secret that even most of our own government does not know it exists. But Admiral, Reyes said, and he looked like a man who had just been told the ground beneath his feet was not real. Their fleet has 12,000 ships, and we have maybe 600. Velasquez turned and looked him dead in the eye. "Colonel," she said, "those 600 ships are the ones we wanted them to see." The room went very still. Out beyond the Valkyrie blockade in the cold and endless dark of space, something was waiting, something enormous, something patient, and it had been there for a very long time. Across the galaxy, dozens of species watched the live feeds from the Sol system on their screens, and they shook their heads and whispered prayers for the humans. They began composing messages of sorrow, because they had seen this before, and they knew how it always ended. 32 years before the Valkyrie arrived, a young signals officer named Priya Nair was working the night shift at Listening Post Echo 9, which floated in the frozen dark near the edge of the Oort cloud, where the sun was nothing more than a bright dot among millions. She was bored and tired, and thinking about the cup of tea she was going to make when her shift ended in 40 minutes. Then her console lit up like a Christmas tree, and every alarm in the tiny station began to scream. The signal was faint and broken, and it came from something moving fast through the outer edges of the solar system. And when Priya cleaned it up and ran it through the translation software, her blood turned to ice. It was Valkyrie. A scouting party of 3 small ships had entered human space, and they were scanning everything, and mapping everything, and recording everything, and then they turned around and left as quietly as they had come. Priya sent her report up the chain, and within 12 hours it was sitting on the desk of every senior leader in the United Terran Command. And that was the moment everything changed. The UTC Council met in secret, and they argued for 3 days straight. And some of them wanted to go public and warn the people of Earth, and others wanted to build a massive visible fleet and dare the Valkyrie to come. But the woman who won the argument was Defense Minister Adaeze Okonkwo, and she stood up in that room and said something that would shape the next 3 decades of human history. If we build a fleet they can see, then they will build a bigger one. And if we warn our people, then our fear will leak into every transmission, and every trade deal, and every diplomatic meeting, and the Valkyrie will know that we know, and they will come before we are ready. She looked around the room. Instead, we do something that no species in this galaxy has ever done before, and we hide and we wait. We are nothing. They called it Doctrine Ghost Veil, and it was the largest and most secret project in the history of the human species. The plan had many parts, and all of them had to work perfectly, or none of them would work at all. First, they created the Visible Fleet, which was the fleet that the rest of the galaxy, and especially the Valkyrie, would see, and it was deliberately kept small and unimpressive. And every ship in it was designed to look just good enough to protect trade routes, but not good enough to fight a real war. Human diplomats went to galactic summits, and they smiled, and they nodded, and they acted exactly like a small and harmless species that was happy just to have a seat at the table. And every word they spoke, and every deal they made was carefully designed to make humanity look like nothing special. Meanwhile, behind the curtain, the real work began. In hollowed-out asteroids, deep in the belt between Mars and Jupiter, construction yards worked around the clock, building warships that did not officially exist behind the moons of Saturn and Jupiter and Neptune. Hidden shipyards assembled dreadnoughts and carriers and strike cruisers that were coated in something called null-sig hull, which was a material that absorbed every type of sensor scan and every form of radiation so completely that the ships were essentially invisible. They built thousands of them, then they built thousands more. They developed weapons that no other species had ever seen, because humanity had a gift for finding new and creative ways to destroy things, and that gift had been sharpened by millions of years of practice. Kinetic lances that fired rods of tungsten at 8% of the speed of light. Cascade warheads that detonated in sequence, each blast stripping away one more layer of enemy shielding until there was nothing left. Void mines that created tiny gravitational distortions strong enough to twist metal. Like wet paper. And they told no one. Not their allies, and not their trade partners, and not even most of their own people. The soldiers and engineers and scientists who worked on Ghost Veil were chosen carefully, and they lived in secret, and many of them spent years away from their families, and they did it because they understood what was coming, and they knew that the survival of their species depended on the enemy never ever finding out. Captain Darius Okonkwo was one of those soldiers, and he was the son of the woman who had created Doctrine Ghost Veil, though very few people knew that. He commanded the stealth dreadnought Silent Hammer, and he had been stationed in the deep void between stars for 3 years, waiting in the dark with his crew of 400 souls. His ship was enormous, but it was invisible, and it drifted through space like a ghost that had forgotten it was dead. There were thousands of ships like his, spread across a vast web that surrounded the Sol system and stretched out along every route the Valkyrie might use to approach Earth. They communicated using quantum burst transmissions that could not be intercepted. And they trained constantly, and they waited, and waited, and waited. 3 years Darius sat in the dark, and he started to wonder if maybe the Valkyrie would never come, and maybe all of this was for nothing. Then one morning the sensor web lit up. Millions of tiny drones that humanity had scattered across a 2-light-year sphere around the sun began to ping one after another like dominoes falling in a line. And the message was clear. They were here. Darius stood on the bridge of the Silent Hammer and watched the Valkyrie Armada pass his position at a distance of less than 40,000 kilometers. And they were enormous and terrifying, and there were so many of them that they blotted out the stars. And they had no idea he was there. Valkyrie's sensor registered his ship or any of the thousands of other human ships that watched from the shadows, as the enemy fleet sailed past them like a parade, marching straight into a canyon with no exit. Darius felt his heart hammering in his chest, and he placed his hand on the console, and he whispered to himself, 32 years, and here we are. He composed a single quantum burst message and sent it to command. The cage has walls, but it has no floor. Admiral Velasquez received that message, and she read it once, and then she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. And when she opened them again, her face was made of iron. 32 years of secrecy and sacrifice and patience. The trap was set. The enemy was inside, and humanity was already behind them. Archon Falvrex was not used to waiting. In his long career, he had conquered 11 species, and each time the pattern was the same, and each time it ended the same way, and the waiting part was always the shortest, because the fear always broke them quickly. Some species surrendered within minutes, and some held out for an hour or two, and one particularly stubborn race of insectoid creatures had lasted almost 4 hours before their queen finally bent her many legs and knelt before the Dominion. But the humans had been silent for almost 5 hours now, and Falvrex did not like silence. He stood on the command bridge of his throne ship, the Eternal Verdict, which was 9 kilometers long, and carried enough firepower to crack a continent in half. And he stared at the blue and green world below him, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He did not know what the feeling was, because he had so little experience with it, but if he had asked a human, they would have told him it was called doubt. "Tactical," he said to his second-in-command, a scarred veteran named Kolshan. "What are the humans doing?" Kolshan checked the sensor readings and frowned. "Nothing, Archon, and that is what concerns me, because they are not mobilizing their fleet, and they are not charging their weapons, and they are not broadcasting any communications at all, and it is as if they have simply decided to sit in the dark and do nothing." Thalvrex made a sound deep in his throat that meant displeasure. "They are afraid," he said, "and fear makes some species go quiet, the way a small animal goes still when a predator is near, and it means nothing." But even as he said it, he was not sure he believed it. 5 hours was too long. Something was wrong, and he could feel it, the way a sailor feels a storm before the clouds arrive. Far away from the Archon's throne ship, in the cold, empty space behind the Valkyrie blockade, something was happening that would have made Thalvrex scream if he had known about it. 8,000 human warships were decloaking. They appeared out of nothing like ghosts stepping through a curtain, and one moment there was empty space, and the next moment there were dreadnoughts and carriers and heavy cruisers and strike frigates arranged in a perfect sphere that wrapped around the entire Valkyrie fleet from the outside. The hunters had become the prey, and they did not even know it. At the same time, something even more dangerous was happening inside the Valkyrie formation itself. During the long approach to Earth, when the Valkyrie Armada had been traveling through the outer solar system, hundreds of tiny human ships had slipped into the gaps between their massive warships. These were infiltration corvettes, and they were so small and so quiet that they could fly within a few hundred meters of a Valkyrie destroyer without being detected. Been hiding among the enemy fleet for hours, like mice living inside the walls of a house. Now those corvettes activated their sensor jammers, and suddenly entire sections of the Valkyrie fleet lost the ability to communicate with each other. Ship captains who had been in constant contact with their squadrons suddenly found themselves alone and deaf and blind, and they began to panic because a Valkyrie soldier without orders from above is like a hand without a brain telling it what to do. But the humans were not finished. 14 light-years away, along the supply line that connected the Valkyrie invasion fleet to Dominion space, a separate human strike force had been waiting with the same patience that defined everything about Ghost Vale. This strike force hit every supply depot and fuel station and reinforcement staging area along the entire route, and they destroyed them all in a coordinated attack that took less than 20 minutes. The Valkyrie Armada at Earth was now completely cut off from home, with no fuel reserves and no ammunition resupply, and no reinforcements coming to help them. And still, the humans were not finished. Years ago, when humanity was still pretending to be a small and harmless species, they had shared trading software with several alien races who did business with the Valkyrie, and buried deep inside that software were code worms created by Terran's Cyber Warfare Division. Those worms had been sleeping for years, passing quietly from system to system until they found their way into Valkyrie fleet computers. And now they woke up. Navigation systems began to feed incorrect data to Valkyrie helmsmen, and targeting computers began to drift just slightly off-center, and shield generators began cycling at wrong frequencies that would make them weaker against specific types of weapons. The kind of weapons that humanity had spent 30 years building. In the Geneva bunker, Admiral Velasquez watched all of this unfold on her display, and every piece was falling into place, like a machine that had been built with absolute precision. She turned to Colonel Reyes, who looked like he was watching a magic trick performed by a god. "Open a channel," she said, "not to the Archon, but to the entire galaxy, and make sure every species with a receiver can hear this. Reyes opened the channel, and his hands were steady now, because fear had been replaced by something much more powerful, and that something was awe. Velasquez straightened her uniform and looked directly into the camera, and when she spoke, her voice was calm and clear, and it carried the weight of 32 years of preparation. To all civilizations watching, she said, take notes, because this is what happens when you mistake preparation for weakness. She paused and let that sink in across 1,000 worlds. Then she turned to her tactical officer and said 2 words that would echo through galactic history for centuries to come. Collapse the ghost veil. And in the dark of space, 8,000 ships lit their weapons at once, and the void around Earth turned bright as a newborn sun. Archon Thalvrex finally felt the full weight of the feeling he could not name. It was not doubt. It was terror. And it was far too late. The first 30 seconds were the worst. Not for the humans, but for the Velkhari, because in those 30 seconds, every truth they had ever believed about themselves and their empire and their place in the galaxy came apart like a building made of sand hit by a wave. The human stealth fleet opened fire from every direction at the same time, and the coordination was so perfect that the first volley struck over 6,000 Velkhari ships in the same heartbeat. Kinetic lances screamed across the void at 8% of the speed of light, and each one was a rod of tungsten the size of a tree trunk. And when they hit a Velkhari warship, they did not explode, because they did not need to. At that speed, the sheer force of impact turned armor plating into vapor, and the rods punched through ships from one end to the other, leaving tunnels of molten metal and fire. Cascade warheads followed, and they were beautiful in a terrible way, because they detonated in sequence, like strings of firecrackers, and each detonation was tuned to a specific shield frequency. And the first blast cracked the outer shield, and the second blast shattered the inner shield, and the third blast hit naked hull, and the fourth blast made sure there was nothing left. Void mines drifted into Velkhari formations and activated, and the space around them twisted and bent, and ships that flew too close found their hulls crumpling inward, as if a giant invisible hand had decided to squeeze them like empty cans. The Velkhari tried to fight back, and they were not cowards, because they had conquered half a galaxy, and their soldiers knew how to die with weapons in their hands. But they could not coordinate. The infiltration corvettes, hidden inside their formation, were jamming every communication frequency, and ship captains screamed orders into dead channels, and squadron leaders tried to organize counterattacks, but their orders went nowhere. Alone. The cyber warfare worms made everything worse, because navigation systems told helmsmen to turn left when they should have turned right, and targeting computers aimed weapons at empty space while human ships fired from the opposite direction. Shield generators cycled at exactly the wrong frequency, which meant that the cascade warheads cut through them like they were made of paper. Some Velkhari ships fired blindly into the chaos, and they hit their own allies, because when you cannot see, and you cannot hear, and you cannot think, the only thing left is panic, and panic makes you dangerous to everyone, including yourself. Captain Darius Okonkwo pushed the silent hammer straight into the heart of the Velkhari command cluster. And he was not alone, because 40 other stealth dreadnoughts flew with him in a spearhead formation aimed directly at the Eternal Verdict, the throne ship of Archon Thalvrex. The Eternal Verdict was 9 kilometers of armored hatred, and it had never been damaged in battle, and its shields were the strongest in the Dominion fleet, and its weapons could glass a planet. Darius did not care. "All forward batteries," he said, and his voice was steady as stone. "Target the throne ship and fire everything we have." 41 dreadnoughts fired at once, and the combined volley was so bright that the sensors on nearby ships had to dim themselves to avoid being blinded. The first wave of kinetic lances hit the Eternal Verdict's forward shields, and the shields held for almost 2 full seconds, which was actually impressive. before they collapsed in a cascade of blue-white energy that looked like lightning made of ice. The second wave hit the hull, and the armor that had never been scratched was torn open in dozens of places, and atmosphere vented into space in great white plumes that froze instantly into clouds of ice crystals. The third wave hit the internal structure, and the great ship shuddered and groaned, as secondary explosions rippled along its length like a chain of volcanoes erupting one after another. But the humans did not destroy it. They could have, and everyone knew it, but the firing stopped just short of a killing blow, and the eternal verdict hung in space, broken and bleeding, but alive. Because Admiral Velasquez had given very specific orders about this. "Cripple the throne ship," she had said, "but do not kill it, because I want the Archon to survive, and I want him to watch." And Thalvrex did watch. He stood on his shattered bridge, surrounded by the bodies of his officers and the sparking ruins of his consoles, and he looked out through a crack in the hull at the battle that was no longer a battle, but a slaughter. His fleet was being taken apart with surgical precision, and the humans were not fighting with rage or hatred, but with the calm efficiency of someone who had practiced this 1,000 times and knew exactly where every cut should go. 80% of the Velkari armada was destroyed or disabled in 6 minutes. 6 minutes. Some of those ships had served the Dominion for centuries and had crushed rebellions and conquered worlds and burned civilizations to ash. And now they were nothing but expanding clouds of debris, drifting through the space around a small blue planet that was supposed to be easy prey. And then something happened that broke Thalvrex more than any weapon ever could. The human visible fleet, the 600 small and unimpressive ships that the Velkari had dismissed as toys, launched from Earth orbit, and they flew directly into the wreckage field. But they did not fire a single shot. Instead, they began picking up Velkari escape pods. They rescued survivors, and they pulled wounded soldiers from broken ships, and they opened their cargo bays and their medical facilities, and they saved the lives of the very people who had come to destroy. Thalvrex watched a human medical frigate dock with a shattered Velkari cruiser, and he saw human soldiers in spacesuits pulling his people out of the wreckage and carrying them to safety, and something inside him that had been hard and cold for his entire life cracked wide open. He opened a channel, and he did not know if anyone could even hear him, but he spoke the words anyway. "This is Archon Thalvrex of the Velkari Dominion," he said, and his voice was raw and broken and old, "and I surrender unconditionally." The Battle of Sol was over. It had lasted 6 minutes and 14 seconds, and the galaxy would never be the same. The galaxy went quiet, in a way it had not been quiet for 10,000 years. Not the quiet of peace, and not the quiet of mourning, but the quiet of every living being in known space, suddenly realizing that everything they thought they understood about power, strength, and fear had just been rewritten by a species most of them had barely noticed. The footage of the Battle of Sol spread across the galactic networks faster than any information had ever traveled before. Every species with eyes watched it. Every species with mouths talked about it. And the ones who had sent messages of sorrow to Earth before the battle now deleted those messages very quickly, and pretended they had never sent them. Within 3 days, 47 diplomatic delegations arrived in the Sol system. And they did not come with sympathy cards. They came with trade agreements and alliance proposals, and very polite requests to please not do to them what humanity had just done. Velkari Admiral Rin Velasquez stood before the Galactic Assembly on the space station called the Forum of Voices, which orbited a neutral star far from any empire, and the chamber was enormous, and it was filled with representatives from over 200 species, and when she walked to the podium, the room was so silent that the sound of her boots on the floor echoed off the distant walls like a heartbeat. She was not a tall woman, and she was not physically intimidating, and she stood at the podium and looked out at a room full of beings who were taller and stronger and older than any human, and she did not flinch. "I will keep this brief," she said, "because I know you are all very busy composing new opinions about humanity, and I would like to help you with that." A few nervous sounds rippled through the chamber, because nobody was entirely sure if that was a joke or a threat. 32 years ago, we discovered that the Velkari Dominion was coming for us, and we had a choice, and the choice was simple, and it was the same choice every species in this room has faced at one time or another. We could trust the galaxy to protect us, or we could protect ourselves. She paused and looked slowly across the rows of alien faces. "We studied every species the Velkari ever conquered, and do you know what we found?" She let the silence stretch. "We found that they were all trusting, and they all believed in good faith, and they all assumed that the galaxy was fundamentally fair, and that someone would help them when the darkness came. No one ever did." The room was painfully quiet now. Humanity does not assume the galaxy is fair, because our history taught us long before we ever reached the stars that the universe does not care about fairness, and it does not care about justice, and it does not reward the kind or the gentle or the trusting. It rewards the prepared. We built Ghost Vale, not because we wanted war, and not because we enjoy deception, and not because we take pleasure in the destruction we cause today. And make no mistake, we do not take pleasure in it. We built it because we looked at the galaxy, and we saw a pattern, and the pattern was simple, and the pattern was this: the species that survive are not the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced, but the ones who refuse to be surprised. Humanity has been refusing to be surprised since the first one of us picked up a sharp rock and decided that the darkness outside the cave was not going to win. She straightened her back, and her eyes were hard, but not cruel. We could have destroyed every Velkari ship in that fleet, and we had the power and the position and the legal right under every galactic convention to do so, because they came to our home uninvited and threatened to turn our world to glass. We chose not to. We rescued their survivors, and we treated their wounded. Returned their soldiers to their homeworld, because we are not what the Velkari are, and we refuse to become what the Velkari are. Remember that when you think about what kind of neighbors we will be." She stepped back from the podium, and she walked out of the chamber, and she did not wait for applause, and she did not wait for questions. And behind her, the room erupted into the loudest debate the Forum of Voices had ever heard. On the Velkari homeworld, a planet called Velkar Prime, the footage of the battle arrived like a bomb that destroyed no buildings, but shattered everything else. For 10,000 years, the Velkari people had been taught that they were supreme, and that their fleet was invincible, and that the Cage of Silence had never failed, and that no species could stand before the Dominion. And then they watched a species they had never heard of take apart their greatest armada in 6 minutes. They watched their Archons surrender, watched human soldiers rescue Velkari survivors from the wreckage, and something changed. It did not change overnight, and it did not change easily because 10,000 years of belief do not crumble in a day. But the crack was there, and it was deep, and it would grow. A generation of young Velkari began asking questions that had never been asked before, and the old leaders who had built the Dominion on fear and conquest found that they had no good answers. Archon Thalvrex was returned to his homeworld as a prisoner of his own people, and he spent the rest of his life in a small room staring at a wall, and when visitors came to ask him about the battle, he only ever said one thing: "We were already dead before we arrived, and we simply did not know it." Captain Darius Okonkwo was offered every medal and every promotion the United Terran Command could give him, and he turned them all down. He went home to Kenya to a small farm in the highlands, where the air was clean and the sky was wide, and he grew coffee, and he watched the sun rise every morning, and he never told a single person what he had done. Most of the crews of the Shadow Armada did the same, and their service records remained classified, and their names never appeared in any history book, and they lived quiet lives among people who would never know that the person next to them at the market or the cafe had once sat in the dark between stars for years waiting to save the world. And they were fine with that, because they had not done it for glory. They had done it because someone had to. Decades later, a young Valkyrie student named Shailton enrolled at a human university on Earth, and she studied human history and human psychology and human warfare, and after 4 years of research, she wrote a thesis that became the most widely read academic work in galactic history. The title was simple: The Species That Was Already Behind You. Argued that humanity's greatest weapon was not their stealth technology or their kinetic lances or their void mines, but something far more dangerous and far more ancient. It was the absolute refusal to accept that the fight was over before it started. It was the stubborn, irrational, bone-deep belief that there is always something you can do, even when every logical calculation says there is not. It was the willingness to sit alone in the dark for years on the chance that one day the darkness would come alive and try to swallow everything you love. Her thesis ended with a proverb that had not existed before the Battle of Saul, but that every Valkyrie child now learned before they could walk. If you cannot see the human, it is already too late. And across the galaxy, species read those words, and they looked at the small blue planet called Earth, and they thought about the people who lived there, and then smiled and traded and laughed, and seemed so very ordinary. Pause, and they wondered what else was hiding in the dark, and they decided very wisely not to find out.